Okay, so the title that I called this workshop is How to Enliven Our Houses and Larger Social Venues. And the idea is maybe if those that have got your cameras off, if you can put them on so I can see who I'm talking to, that would be really nice. Yeah, please put your cameras on. That's a whole lot.
Sorry, this is Don McPhee. For some reason, my camera is not working, so it's
okay.
I'm not being shy. It's just my technology.
Maybe that's super. Simon, David, Alana, could you please put your cameras on so I can see? Yeah, much better.
I'm switched, sorry to interrupt. I'm switching mine off because of the movement and the Wi-Fi, so I'm listening in, if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm just going to mute you. There we go. Okay, super. I'm going to start. So, my thought about social development is that when you do social development, you do a lot of talking. I mean, as a career, you do a lot of talking and a lot of listening. I mean, that's one of the main things that you do. You sit around and you talk and you listen a lot. And the question is, where do these conversations actually happen? And what kind of conversations happen where? And I'll give you an example, because there's a whole range of different kinds of conversations, but different kinds of conversations happen in different places in our homes and at our venues. For example, when somebody's leaving your house, they might be in the hallway, they might be at the gate, they might be just before you get to the gate, they might be at the garden, they might be just before they climb in the car. And often you'll find that conversations that happen at these junctions are different to conversations that happen in the lounge or at the dining room table. It's almost as if you're going to meet somebody and you have this conversation with them, but there was something that you wanted to say, but you haven't said it yet, and you know they're about to leave, so you better say it now. And often stuff arises or comes up at these moments that otherwise doesn't come up. And what is interesting about the placement of these conversations is that they happen just at the threshold of a place. They happen at the door. They happen just outside the door on the veranda. They happen when you're standing up. They happen just before the gate or at the gate, which is a different kind of conversation to what you might have when you're sitting on the couch in the lounge or you're sitting around a table. So there's a whole range of different kinds of conversations, and they happen in different places. So the nature of what we're going to be discussing today is what are the different kinds of conversations that we can have, and where exactly do they happen? What is the architectural and environmental configuration of where these conversations happen, in order that there's a possibility that we could recreate the architecture and the environment to catalyze or facilitate particular kinds of conversations. So when we look at conversations in general, there's a whole range. I mean, if we just think simplistically about that, we think, we feel, and we do, that we have thought conversations where we share ideas and concepts and theories and maybe mathematics or something like that. And we have a whole range of feeling conversations where we talk about connection or feeling or process or something around that, or even aesthetics. And then we have conversations about taking action and organizing. Like if I have a whole lot of contractors and subcontractors, we sit down at a table and we discuss things, and we've all got notebooks and we write up stuff and we have action plans. That's a particular kind of conversation. And then there's another kind of conversation. Some people call it a generative conversation, or you could call it a creative conversation, where something happens that doesn't normally happen in a conversation where information is exchanged. It's a conversation where, for example, most conversations come out of the past. They're about things that have happened, or thoughts that we have had, or things that we have done, or things that we are going to do that we haven't done, or are planning to do. And there are some conversations that come out of the future, and they have a very different quality. It's like what comes to us in a quiet, almost inspired way, where neither of us necessarily have an idea of what was about to arise. It's like an idea enters into the conversation that was never there before, or a thought or an insight. And there's a particular moment or atmosphere or condition where those kind of conversations happen. And often they're quite intimate, they're gentle, there's a lot of listening, there's a lot of pausing. And those conversations don't always happen anywhere. They happen in particular places. But I'd like to take one step back. And what I'm going to do is that we're going to get into groups of 3. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of conversations that we can potentially have. What are these conversations? What is the range of conversations that we have? And it's not so much about the content as the intent. So there's a whole range of conversations that we can potentially have, and we're going to have a look at some of those. And then we're going to start identifying where those conversations typically happen in our homes, and then where they can happen in venues, and how we can adjust venues to facilitate those kinds of conversation. So we're going to go into groups of 3, and we're just going to discuss what kinds of conversations are there. Because there's a whole range of different conversations that we can potentially have. And there's a limited range of them. And it's not specifically the subject matter of the conversation. That's obviously part of it, but there's also the nature of the conversation. There's those 2 sides to it. Does anybody have any questions at this point? So we've got about 20 minutes in a groups of 3 just to identify different kinds of conversations and qualities of conversation and qualities of listening. Super. Doug, can you?
Yeah, it's mostly rooms of 3.
Yes.
One room of 2.
That's
okay.
Fine. Super.
Right, here we go. How long is it for, Keith?
20 minutes.
Okay.
I am coming. Your article was so great, and I am so interested with this in this idea of space and the relation you are doing between the space, the inner space, and the space outside. And just to tell you, I experienced a kind of experience like yours, a kind of stuff where I suddenly took. I suddenly realized my inner space, and I remember I was in my apartment, in my flat, and I was looking at the walls, and I was saying, these houses are so weird, and that's not appropriated for us, for a human life. And I was at home, and I felt in a foreign space, because that didn't reflected the new spacious awareness I've just met within, actually. And that was really interesting to see in your article that another human being felt really weird in his apartment. and realized that other models of architecture could be more appropriate for our spiritual expansion and to reflect the infinity we are. Yes.
Super. Madeleine, thank you. Fantastic.
Yeah, I was really happy, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I am also an introvert. Consequently, I really reflect in your article, and that was amazing.
Super. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do now is, from our conversations, is just to spend 10 minutes on your own drawing the conversations. I'll give you an example. So here could be a discussion of two people where one is being a little bit more aggressive and the other is a bit more defensive. And here's a conversation where there's quite a lot of inner work happening on the one side and the other is quite active. So it's almost like a doodle in a way, more like a Spanish artist like a Picasso or a Miro than, let's say, a Vermeer or a Rembrandt. So you're not doing a literal picture of two people. You're just kind of documenting a little bit of an expressiveness of the nature of the conversation, the flavor, the texture, the feeling of it. And you can do that in colors, you can do that in washes, you can do that just sketchily. And you might have made some notes of like, there's these kind of conversations, or this is, or you could just choose one particular kind of conversation and just draw a little bit around it so that you can get a feel for what is the nature of the interaction. Is that clear? Is this anybody, just so that we can just do something other than talking, that we can actually be a little bit artistic around it? That would be super. And then we're going to have a discussion. So we've got about 10 minutes, just quietly. Tanya, all good? If those whose cameras are off, if you could put your cameras back on, that would be great. And it would be nice if you held up to the screen your drawing so we can see what we have done. Interesting. Fantastic. Huh. Brilliant. Very nice. Okay. Very interesting. Super. So I'd like to open the floor just in terms, just sharing something of any particular insights or from your smaller group discussions. If anybody had any particular thoughts or just a general overview.
Yeah, Keith. We in our group spoke about the different aspects that affect conversation, and they have to do with many variables. Time of day became something that was mentioned, as well as space, as well as connection with nature. And yeah, so we, at least I, found it difficult to isolate space in relation to conversation, and just looked at how many different elements contribute towards that feeling of well-being, which fosters good conversation. But for me, the aesthetic of the built environment is a very important factor.
Thanks, Sue. It's interesting that you mentioned this thing of that a particular mood or a sense of well-being fosters a healthy conversation. That it's almost like the mood and the conversation run in tandem. I'm wanting to focus on just the nature of different kinds of conversations, and then we're going to talk about the context in which the conversations happen in more detail. So just more about just the nature of conversation.
One of the things that came up in our group was the nature of conversation was around connection and building community, and also connection with the self. So there's connection with the self, connection with others, and building community.
Could you say just a little bit more about that?
That I'll give the example that I gave in our group.
Great.
On Sunday mornings, my mother's kitchen was like the central railway station. She'd be busy cooking, whatever she's cooking for lunch, and people would literally just drop in. It would be family, friends, and there was no rhyme or reason why they came. They came to connect. They came because the space was there. So there was a particular time, it was a Sunday morning, people were free. There was a defined space, which was the kitchen. And there was a defined activity happening. Someone was going to be cooking in the kitchen at a particular time, right? And so with those variables in place, people that were floating around and didn't have, that knew that, they would come in and they would just make themselves a cup of coffee or get water or whatever they wanted while my mother was cooking. And in that time and space, they would be catching up. There would be exchange of information, who's doing what in the family, in the community, etc., updating and sharing, and counseling and therapy as well, right? So that was the around community and connection.
Okay, fantastic. Yasmin, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could chip in here.
Yes,
it kind of connects to much of that. I mean, one is around kind of, I suppose, a liberating space where you're helping people to be their better selves, to try and bring a measure of equality to, because in situations obviously of hierarchy, people are more likely to have their defenses up. So a more defenseless space we spoke about, and also one that can that helps people to feel that their particular culture is respected, which is often why, you know, no matter how beautiful a fancy hotel spaces are, it's still very uncomfortable for many people, whatever the context. Yeah, and then connected to that, then also is I think you spoke about the liminal spaces, and these are unprepared spaces where our defenses are more likely to be down, and hierarchies are less important in that kind of community space, informal spaces. So a lot is about then how can we be free? I think that's quite key here.
Yeah. Nice, thanks, Doug. Fantastic.
Yeah, we talked about these spaces also liminal, where you're leaving, and often you stand at the car for ages, with the door open, trying to get in there, and took me back to parents at school meetings where the formal meeting would happen and there's all this formal conversation, and then the real conversation that happens in the car park became known as car park conversations. But Yasmin, what you were talking about, the cooking, made me think of when I was doing sculpture with a friend. And every week we would all sit around and we would be working with our clay. And we only after months we realized, actually, this is it's not just, we're not just doing clay, we're actually having really interesting, well, therapeutic conversations. And so that thing of being active and meeting and doing something else while we talking, it nurtured very interesting conversations.
Super, Liz. I think most art workshops are exactly that. They are conversation centers in a certain sense. I'd like to just say something a little bit about the car park conversations or the liminal space conversations, because they've got a particular nuance around them. And that is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's like when somebody's leaving, you need to say the things that you want to say to them now because they're going to be gone. So stuff comes up that doesn't otherwise come up. But what is also interesting is that when you are about to leave, you can leave. And you can legitimately say, if the conversation is getting a bit intense, I need to go now. Well, you don't necessarily legitimately say that, but you could say that without having to apologize. Whereas if you're having the same conversation in a closed room, it's a little bit more obvious when you say, no, I need to leave now. Whereas if you're standing at the car or at the space to go, it often happens that the conversation intensifies. And then somebody is about to leave, but they don't leave, but they know they can leave. So somewhere the nature of the interaction changes because you can address an intensity of interaction there, knowing that you don't necessarily have to hang in there the whole way through, as much as you do hang in the whole way through or can hang in the whole way through. And it's interesting how that liminal space gives you that possibility. And exactly what Doug was saying was that there's this informality, this kind of there's an informality that allows for an informality in the discussion, compared to sitting around a well-orchestrated boardroom table with the pictures straight up and down. It's a different quality. Super. Somebody else wanted to say something.
I just wanted to add, as Doug was speaking, what struck me was that whoever was involved in the conversation needed to feel safe.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a sense of safety where you let down your guard and reveal layers of yourself, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe something
Maybe
just
I'll
to add.
Yes,
No,
please.
go ahead.
Sorry, no, go, Michael. Sorry, just briefly to add, I think both the cooking example, the art example, and also made me think of working in the garden or walking, having these activities that allow for spaces where for those that want to contribute into the conversation, feel they can, and those that want to listen feel they're safe to listen. Whereas in a space where you're all sitting around a table, maybe it doesn't allow so much for those that just want to sit back and listen. And there's a tension there, I think, for me, where in the informal spaces allow more, and maybe the active spaces of conversation allow for those that feel more in the listening to be the listeners, and those otherwise.
That's absolutely that. I know I can remember going to ceramic classes and everybody's busy with the ceramic sculpture. So you're part of the group on hand of the fact that you're doing that. So even if you're not saying something, you're still visually part of the group. And that gives that kind of that dance where you can participate, but even if you're not, it's fine because everybody knows that you're present and there. Yeah, exactly. It's beautiful, that nuance. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I was just going to pick up on a couple of points that we raised earlier, that our conversation took into a bit of a different place. We were talking to somebody who was living in Sudan. So it immediately brought up all these images of travel and, you know, memories of conversations that happened in strange places, like cars on very long journeys, or airport waiting rooms, or sitting next to someone in some strange place, or even a venue that was really awful, but the conversation was really intense and deep. So it sort of complexified this idea of how much it's this physical space, how much it's the fact that you've got time, or that you're unfettered by other things, or that you've just been thrown together and you're there for a long time, so you might as well talk. Or even your point, just means sometimes in those situations, because you might never see them again, you talk more than you would otherwise. So you're saying you're going to move on to context, Keith, and I suppose we were grappling a lot with how much the context of everything that's going on is influencing it, as much as and the physical space is part of that, but it's not just the physicality of it, it's everything that it means in that moment. So I don't know, that's what we were picking up.
Sure. Thank you. James, have you had any thoughts around this?
Lots of thoughts, and from our conversation too, there was some very interesting sort of social media came up, which I'm not going to go into, but it really prompted us to think about virtual structures and spaces and the kind of impact they're having on us too. But the one that stayed with me, you know, having spent so much of my life in earnest conversation, I've been struck recently by an evening of people sharing funny stories, hilarious stories from their lives. And I was just reflecting on that, you know, superficially, it's just a hell of a fun evening with immense amounts of laughter. But being prompted to think about conversation, it has some remarkable qualities, actually. You know, you get the natural storytellers who tend to dominate and entertain immensely, but in so doing reveal enormous amounts of themselves and their biographies, and just great depth of who they are and what's important to them. It reveals the importance of having an audience of listeners who don't feel, you know, that being fireside storytellers is their thing, but without them, the stories would never come out or be half as rich as they are. Fire, I realized, was a significant facilitator of good storytelling. And drugs, you know, a bit of alcohol in this instance really lubricated, I think, the conversation. And I wonder culturally and historically whether there hasn't been a place for that in many, many good recreational conversations. And that's the word that came to my mind, is it's just a recreational conversation, but it really was about people recreating themselves through their stories. So that kind of double take on recreation. So yeah, that was one of my thoughts, being prompted to think about conversation.
Super. Thanks, James. That's fantastic. Yeah. Ken, have you had any particular thoughts?
Actually, Doug and Jasmine have also referenced it before, but thinking back to one of the closing workshops where we were talking about safe spaces and brave spaces, and how Mikhail also mentioned that it wasn't just the space, but also everything else that came together in support of that enabling conversation. And I think for me, what you mentioned earlier, James, about these recreational conversations, and sometimes, you know, what starts off as a light and seemingly superficial conversation, then either, in my experience, for me, in my conversations, becoming tense or becoming something more in depth and something more substantial, and becoming a generative conversation. And so I think that it's also about the individual's readiness to, you know, what would be then my contribution, or others who are in conversation with me, their readiness to contribute to that conversation and take it to different levels or venues or different types of conversation as well. Yes.
Super. Thanks, Kin. Welcome, Mark. Nice to see you here. So,
hello, thank you.
Greetings. So what I'd like to do now is that we're going to do an observation exercise where, in the place where we are, somewhere around where we are, we're going to have a look, we're going to think about a significant conversation that happened. And we're going to go to the place where this conversation happened. And we're going to look at the context of what was around in that particular place. So we're going to look at a number of things, and maybe you'd like to make a note of this. We're going to look at the quality of the light. We're going to look at the colors. We're going to look at the sounds that are around in that place. What the environment is. What the volume of the space is. What the proximity is between you and the others. What time of day did the conversation happen? What are the textures in the environment like? What was your view? What was the quality of the air? And what was the beauty? Was it a beautiful place? Where was the beauty? Because from an architectural perspective, it is actually possible to design places that facilitate particular kinds of conversations, or at least encourage them. But it's a very, very subtle process. And what I'm asking you to do is to go to this place and look really carefully. Where do you sit? What do you see? How do you relate to the other person? What is actually happening all around you? And when you look really carefully, and we're going to share this afterwards, we might find certain commonalities and certain features that facilitate an easy discussion or an in-depth discussion or whatever it is. So you've got about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll ring the bell. So it's now 7 minutes past 1. Let's say at 25 past 1, we can come back and observe, sit there quietly and take note of things that might not at first appear significant, but they might be subtle and they are significant. Does anybody have any questions? Super. I'll see you in a short while. Enjoy.
There is a hand raised there from King.
Yes, King.
Sorry, Keith. I'm wondering, when you say to go to the place, can we go to it in our imagination?
If you need to, if you can't go there in your imagination, go there physically.
I can't go there physically.
Okay, super.
And sorry, Keith, could you say
Yes.
again what was the brief for the place? What's the place we're trying to go to, whether physically or not?
You're going to a place where you had a significant conversation.
Okay.
A conversation that stands out for you. It could be a strong connection with somebody, or it could be a situation where you had a new insight and you changed how you think about your life or the world, or you connected with somebody that you didn't expect to connect with in the kind of way that you did. But okay, let me just rephrase this slightly. What I'm saying is that when you look at our buildings and our environments, you can look through the lens of conversation and say that there's many different conversations that happen in many different places. But there's some conversations that gravitate towards particular places, and they are amplified in those places, and they happen more frequently in those places. And what is the configuration of those places? So I'm asking you to choose a particular place and just to be cognizant of all the subtleties of what's around you in that particular place. I think let's meet at 1:30 because we've taken up a bit more time. So you've got 20 minutes just to sit there quietly and get into the space. Super, thank you. I think some people might be lost in their gardens somewhere. Super. So it would be very nice if, before we go to the next step, if two people could share a little bit of the situation of a fantastic conversation or an intense conversation or whatever. Maybe somebody more from the countryside and somebody more from an urban setting, so we get a little bit of a contrast.
I'd quite like to be one of the people.
Go for it, Ali.
Okay. So hello everyone, I'm Ali. I know you don't really know me. I feel I know you because I've come to all your workshops, and I am here in the land of Ireland. And yeah, so the space I thought of actually is the space that I am living in at the moment. And it's a 200-year-old cottage. It was built 200 years ago, and it's got a thatched roof, and it's quite incredible. And I have had some conversations in the kitchen. So like I just had a dear friend came, and so let me just look at my notes of what we were going to talk about. Yeah, so it's a small space. It has a low ceiling, and it has.
Are you on a laptop or on a PC?
I'm on a laptop. Do you want to see it?
Can you show us? Yes.
You want to see it? Okay.
No,
okay.
we want to see it.
Okay, I'll just check that I don't lose internet while I do this.
If you can.
Yeah, and okay, so what I'll do is I'll carry this around. Okay. So first of all, I'm just going to show you it from outside, so you can see. How do I do this? I'm going to keep going like this. Yes, can you see the roof?
Yes.
Yeah.
It
so
looks very old.
Yeah, and this is it is interesting, and I think it can relate for all of us, that this, I mean, this is actually quite a big cottage. This was tenant farmers who were doing quite well. And then basically the landlord, Lord Louth, just kept putting the rents up higher and higher, and they stopped paying. And then he basically sent in the army, the soldiers, to evict them. And this is in 1880. And they barricaded them. Yeah.
Ellie,
Yes.
outside of the history, could we go into our kitchen?
Yeah, we can go into the kitchen now. Anyway,
Okay.
just to say, they got back into the house eventually.
Fantastic.
Okay. I'm trying to walk backwards. Yeah, so what I was going to say about the kitchen, whoa, that's the old fireplace, and that beam there, what I like about it is I can see the people who lived here before.
Yeah.
And I can see that their fire burned that beam. And I was actually thinking that's one category I'd add.
Ellie, your internet is disappearing.
Other bodies in the space.
Yeah.
Okay. And just going to show, that was the little seat. I don't know if I can show that properly.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay.
So you've really got a window seat with the light quite close, with a deep reveal to the window and this warm atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think what I would say, can you hear me again?
Yeah.
Yeah, and in actual fact, this conversation happened at midnight, so the window is dark, the lights are low. And also, just what I wanted to say was that little seat, my guest is on that seat, or the cat, and I'm on a little stool, and it's like our knees are almost touching, or if our legs are crossed, they're almost intertwined. I mean, this is a friend, but a close friend. So there's that kind of the two bodies starting to connect together, very close. And also maybe the time of night, I was thinking it was a bit like the car park and people are going to leave. I thought, gosh, we need to go to bed soon. But we just kept talking. At any point we could, in the end, we went to bed, it was 3 a.m. But, you know, you didn't quite know when it was going to end, but it was up to us when it ended, and we just kept going. So, yeah, I think that's all I'll share.
Thank you, Ellie. That's fantastic. Yeah. Brilliant. We really get a good picture of it, actually. Yeah.
Cool,
thanks.
Good. Thanks.
Sue and Elle, would you like to share anything from your side? You muted, Sue.
Think of this place.
There we go.
Yeah. So we have had guests here for the weekend, the Easter weekend, and we were meeting at certain times of the day to have conversation, and we were then doing our own thing at other times of the day. And so the place that I'm sitting now is more or less where the conversation took place. And there was something about the intentional nature of the conversation that felt really important. There were times when we paused, we went off, we made a cup of tea, we had a pee. Sometimes we moved to the other side of the room. So a sense of spaciousness in the space felt really important, that we weren't kind of too close to each other, there wasn't a sense of claustrophobia. There was a feeling of air moving around, and almost all the conversations took place in the daytime. And yeah, we were all able to look out of the windows and really experience the day moving around us, and the birds around us and the sounds of nature around us. And all of these were weaving into the conversation, which kind of built on itself. So it happened over what, 3 or 4 days. And in those 3 or 4 days, we were really building something which the light and the space around was woven into. And they were, for the most part, daytime conversations.
I just want to add that the one thing that strikes me strongly is the view, not the view, sorry, the spaciousness of the gaze. So you could be intimately with someone and at the same time look out very, very far. And what struck me was the combination of being individual and being collective. At the same, you could move between the two. And the other thing that strikes me was the sense of being alone, not alone, being that the group of people are alone in that conversation. There's a sense of privacy, I suppose,
and no,
to the whole conversation.
Yeah, no fear of being interrupted. And coming back to the point that I made earlier, our best conversations happen in the morning. Yeah.
Sue and Elle, thank you. I'd like to add something just in terms of the nature of the venue, because I know exactly where you are on the nature of the venue. And on the one side of a very long, thick table is a built-in bench that gives you a sense of kind of a comfort and a establishment. And the bench is quite solid. I mean, the table is solid. So you get the feeling that you don't have this flimsiness, that there's a thunk to it. And it changes the quality. And also the volume of the space is quite large, and then it drops, and then it drops, and it rises on the other side. So there's this breathing quality that you were talking about, where you can breathe into the conversation and out of the conversation. And also these views, yeah. And the table isn't too wide, so that you do feel exactly what you had, Ali, that there's a certain intimacy or a certain connection. It's not like you sitting at a particular distance apart. Thank you, that's fantastic. So what I'd like to do is that now you can imagine that you're going to run a process at a venue. And you're going to select a venue. And the question is that you might be asking yourself is, how can I select a venue that would give the participants and everybody involved the best possibility of healthy conversations? Can I have a really healthy interaction in an auditorium that's air-conditioned, that has no views outside, that has a blackboard in the front? Maybe I could, but I could potentially improve on that. So what I'd like you to do now is just to think, and I think it's just going to be an open forum. We've got 20 minutes left, to think of particular venues that have certain features that have precipitated a healthy kind of interactive conversation that has some depth. And we can just share that as we sit, as we are here. If you think of a place or a venue that had some feature or some quality where conversations of a particular nature just occurred on a regular basis. And the idea behind this is that if you're going to select a venue, think conversation when you're selecting the venue. Think, what does the space facilitate as a quality of interaction? The floor is open.
I just want to throw something in to start, which is, you know, as you say that, Keith, I just think, I can't think of a single one, like a public venue that I could book or as part of a project that meets what I would like. And then I suddenly had all these memories of working as a facilitator that's like now here in Ireland or Dublin, where how immovable and intractable the venues are, and the ones that maybe our clients or partners want to use. Even like working with the government here, being in a venue where we were not allowed to unlock the chairs from each other that were in rows, just even to turn and have a small circle conversation. So that's, and also and I think moving from online back into a few in-person gatherings in the last few weeks, I'm finding air conditioning and projector machine sounds very troubling myself. Like, and they're just there in every space. Even more, venues are bringing them in now for air purifying reasons. And then just the final point to say is, when I was thinking of spaces, I proposed my home, and I thought some others, and all the spaces I thought of were actual homes that people lived in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Ali, thank you. Yes, I think there is definitely a dearth of well-designed venues that facilitate this kind of thing. There's no question about that. Yeah. As far as Ireland, even from Cape Town to Ireland, the whole way. But there are gems, there are places that have them, and I'm interested to know if anybody's been to some obscure place that has these things, has a different quality.
Keith, I want
Yes.
to throw in well, it's not a curveball, but I know those kind of spaces, and I'm the sort of person that likes these venues with gardens and windows and light and all of these things. But a number of years ago, I found myself working in Orange Farm outside of Johannesburg, and the venue we had was a very dark room with one window and a little bit of light that would come in, and it was often cold. And I just thought, how the hell am I going to work here? And the lesson I learned was really profound, because we used a lot of sort of world cafes and small tables and things. And the venue had been used by a sewing group. So they were people who were very connected to color and texture and materials and stuff. And some weeks into that process, they started decorating the room, putting fabrics on the tables and sometimes up on the walls. And the one woman loved flowers, so she would make little vases with flowers and would bring them in. And so I never asked anybody to do any of this. Something happened in the process that was going on that somehow invited them to, in their words, in their language, in their idiom, beautify that space. But the actual literal physical space remains pretty awful, to be honest. And yet, some of the conversations that have happened there for me have been the most vibrant, alive, warm, deep conversations. So my whole sensibility around this question that you're raising was thrown into serious question when I was there and when I was working with them. But I understand what you mean. And I think I'm just saying I've learned that it's not so fixed as I thought.
No, absolutely. And there's always exceptions. Yeah.
Keith,
Gavin.
Okay, so both of the spaces, the one that I reflected on when asked to do the exercise, I didn't reflect on where I am now because I've just moved in. So there've been only a few conversations and mostly working ones. But the conversations over the last year for me that have been most powerful and creative, productive, and involving several people have been out in the middle of Marikana, and it's in the middle of part of the settlement called Mahumapelo 2, and it's just shacks all around. But right in the middle of it, there's a space where a woman years ago, and now there are 8 women and 2 men working together there. They've created wonderful vegetable gardens, and they sell vegetables to the shacks around, so people come and buy every day. And so we've been having a conversation with those women and a group of youth activists from Marikana called Marikana Youth Development Organization, full of fire, passion, spent their lives organizing against everybody you can think of. And the women very quietly and calmly have been organizing for.
Where does the conversation happen? What is the venue?
The conversation happens, there's the garden on one side, and beyond that, the shacks. And it's against we sit with our backs against a house that they've built. And there's a big tree, and so it's a semicircle. And it's a feeling of that there's stuff happening all the way around, but in the semicircle, it's safe and private. And the tree is at the center of the semicircle. So we all are really looking at the tree. We can see each other, but no one's looking directly into each other's eyes. You can listen carefully to someone and look at them, and in fact, our bodies do turn at times. But it's this thing of being able to talk, and you're talking to the whole world and to those closest to you and to yourself. And it's this thing of having created a space out in this image of Orange Farm, the space itself not being wonderful, but just this fact of having sculpted out of almost with very little materials, but just through patient effort and dedication, a space that can hold conversation, and it's not only for conversation. The conversation can be broken by someone coming to buy a bunch of spinach, and one of the women will go and cut spinach. But this really thoughtful conversation about what we can do to change the whole place, the whole of this terrible shackland.
Gavin, that's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah.
So Keith, I was thinking that
yes, go, Kathy.
As others have said, there's in my experience, no ideal venue, but the ones that have worked the best have been where there's been garden space and outdoor space for people to go, and that's where the deep conversations happen. But that also helps. So I'm thinking probably the best conversations I've been part of in Cape Town have been at Gatehouse. I don't know if you know Gatehouse. But the other places like there's the Vineyard Hotel, and I was thinking about Spear for my own example of a good conversation. The conference venues are horrendous, but there is the outdoor space, and there's something about being able to move. And I went and looked up the etymology of the word converse, and it's very interesting.
Tell us.
So in the mid-14th century, there's an obsolete sense to move about, to live, to dwell, to live or behave in a certain way. And it comes ultimately from the Latin conversare, which literally means to turn round with. So I had this thing of, how is it possible to converse if you don't move? Because the body is movement. And that seems to me, that's when the richest conversations are possible, is when people can get out and move a bit.
Yeah.
And our spaces just render us so static.
Super. Thank you, Kathy.
I like the idea of movement, and I think if I think back to the CDRA space that you designed, Keith, even in the still rooms, the shapes were mobile, the curves were so important, and I think too many straight lines do rigidify. So I think curved lines, and then I think wood has an amazing impact. Just lots of wooden, whether it's the furniture or features, and then of course trees. You know, where the trees are, and wherever we had conversations in CDRA, there was that tree right in the heart of the building. You know, reaching out towards all of us. And I think many of the conversations I've had actually have been under trees. I could name quite a few. The direct opposite of that, and when Gavin mentioned that he had a tree in the middle, and maybe this is not what one should have, but what one shouldn't have. I wonder how many of you have been booked into a venue that has a pillar in the middle. That's just how you can't work in it. And then you retreat into the garden or the lobby or wherever. But that damn pillar is the worst. So there's a definite what we don't want. Yeah.
Super. Thanks, Doug. Anybody else before we come to the end? Yes, Kinkin.
Here in Siem Reap, there's the JRS, the Jesuit center that's called Metta Karuna, and I can put the link in the chat. It's a reflection center, and it's it's open house all the time. It welcomes refugees, it welcomes migrants, and also different people doing retreats. And so it has a Buddhist, Christian, and also like a Jewish history with the history of Cambodia and the peace walk. And so it is an open space where, and I thought about it because in my conversation with Liz and her daughter, we were talking about labyrinths, and it has a labyrinth for reflection. It has an open dining area where if you want a place with a roof and a bit of a cover, then you can go there. So it's a very fluid space where different people with different needs can sort of, and it's also a place where the mine survivors can also come, because the Jesuits were involved with the anti-mining of Cambodia. And so, part of it is also their rehabilitation. So really, catered to different populations. And I was thinking about what Mikael said as well, about how we simply embody a space and make it ours gradually. And so, it's if I were to think of a space, so Sister Denise, who has been in Cambodia for decades, I had a recent conversation with her about the situation in Myanmar and how people are relating to it, ASEAN being just a work-related conversation, but all aspects of it simply woven in to the conversation, where it was the personal, the work, and also the challenges facing, like at a more regional level, the country level, and family level. And so just that the fluidity of it. That's something that and then Siem Reap is, it's not quite urban, it's not quite rural, it's somewhere in between.
So you've got all this breathing quality of semi-open spaces, semi-closed, and somehow, I mean, what I'm hearing is that the nature of the environment has a breathing quality, and the conversations can breathe in that, in a certain sense.
And also it could be a secular space, it could be a spiritual space, depending on where we are, who we are as well. And so, and it's both concrete and garden and nature.
Yeah. Super. Kin, thanks very much. James, did you want to say something before, and Alan?
No, thanks, Keith. I was waving goodbye to Liz, who says she's going.
Okay.
Bye,
Okay.
Liz.
She's not. Alan, did you want to say something? You muted. There you go.
I was just reflecting on how few interesting, intimate, true places I have met in many, many years of facilitating in many different countries. So I started thinking back, and I remembered the little village of McGregor and how we transformed a very, very rigid, old, stuck Engelkerk hall. I'm not even sure that it was a hall. I think it was maybe a room off Koshuis, a hostel, into a place of great creativity and intimacy through the addition of a whole bunch of old, eclectic, contradictory chairs and sofas. That's all we had. There were no other chairs, but when we put those things in, it transformed the space. Just a thought.
Thanks, Ali. I have to say, when I think of chairs, I think venues should have a range of different chairs and couches. It makes a huge difference. Absolutely. It sounds amazing. So I'd like to come to a conclusion. It's 2 o'clock. And just to say that when you think of your own home and when you think of venues, you can also think of them as places for particular kinds of conversation. And how can you best nuance and encourage that to happen in these places? And it's a nice lens to look at the world through, as opposed to architecture as a building. Think of it as architecture as a place to have conversations. So thank you very much for attending. It's been fantastic. And yeah, we'll see you at the next workshop, possibly. Super. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Madly.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Cheers,
Thank you so
Mark.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Later.